Welcome to the Freedom Cities podcast, where we explore bold new ideas in city building and improving regulation in the United States. Hi, Isaiah. Welcome to the Freedom Cities podcast.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Really excited.
And so you recently got a pretty big win. So I don't know, talk about that and like who you are and why you're here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Isaiah. I'm the founder and CEO of Valar Atomics. Just a couple days ago, we announced our $19 million seed round, as well as a contract with the government of the Philippines to turn on our first nuclear reactor. And then most importantly, we've announced that we just built our first piece of hardware, our non-nuclear test reactor. So we essentially built a nuclear prototype of our first reactor here in Los Angeles. So just unveiled those three things a couple of days ago. So yeah, we're super excited.
Congratulations. How did you get interested into Valar Atomics? What's the vision?
Yeah, so this is something I've been thinking about for many years. Valar Atomics, the essential idea is that we want to build hundreds of nuclear reactors on what we call a gigasite. So a gigasite is like a very large power campus. And the reason that you want to have large power campuses with hundreds of reactors is that you get to have these economies of scale, which end up being really incredible and really cheap. So we're talking about, you have one environmental review, which covers the entire site, but you get to build 100 reactors on it. You get to have, one piece of site security, and that covers, the entire scope of the site. So you get these economies of scale that are really incredible, and we think it'll genuinely make nuclear energy the cheapest form of energy generation on Earth, like it once was. And what we're going to do with that, I think, is even more exciting. We're building these large power campuses for large industrial power. So things like advanced manufacturing, metals electrolysis, data centers, and then actually creating synthetic fuels. So we can make diesel, we can make jet fuel, we can make gasoline from CO2 and water using these scaled nuclear reactors.
Cool. I guess what are some of the challenges? Because the NRC has approved like 2 or 3 nuclear plants in the last 50 years, and even those haven't really started construction. So like, how do you view like the regulatory landscape, and how were you able to move so quickly with the government of the Philippines?
Yeah, the NRC has approved 4 construction permits since 1978. And, this is just one of these problems where you have a regulator that got some bad feedback from Congress and from the public after 3 Mile Island, especially in some of these nuclear incidents that had a really oversized impact on public perception about nuclear. And so unfortunately, it needs an entire overhaul to be able to build nuclear again. Congress has tried to give that mandate, but it's taken a long time to get into effect. And so, our process so far is to build as fast as we can. We believe that, one, you can build a very safe nuclear reactor through the right technology architecture. But the other thing is that, building quickly and building iteratively and actually getting testing with a real thing gives you this element of safety that just designing on paper does not. So our approach is to build quickly, to iterate, and to discover, everything that we need to know about the engineering as we do it and as we build it. And that yields this incredibly safe machine over time. So we would really love to see, a regulatory environment in the US that supports this rapid, iterative building like it does in the rest of the world. A lot of people don't realize that the rest of the world doesn't have the same regulatory process as the United States, and especially as the federal government. And you can be more iterative, you can be faster, and you can get through these engineering milestones quicker. So that's what we have. And yeah, we're really excited to turn our first reactor on in the Philippines next year.
Great. Yeah, and I understand Texas, their legislative session this year, nuclear is one of their 2 or 3 legislative priorities. I guess one question is what would the ideal regulatory framework look like to allow you to turn on a bunch of plants in the US?
Yeah, I think the ideal regulatory framework is that, first of all, states should be able to regulate their own nuclear reactors, right? You want to be able to have Texas and West Virginia and Utah and these different states raise their hand and say, we think that we have a really good way of turning on these plants and regulating these reactors. That's really the framework that the founding fathers actually gave us to begin with for regulation, is that states can figure out their own methods, and that itself is an iterative process, right? And you can have these different ideas and different ways of doing things. So I think most generally, more ways of doing things is the most important in terms of solving this regulatory problem. But as far as a specific framework, look, it should be source term based, right? You should be looking at what is the actual, worst case event out of a, certain volume of radioactive material. And it should be technology agnostic. You should be able to rapidly innovate and iterate and find different ways of keeping that safe and producing energy. And the regulator should really just be checking your math on that.
Cool. And what excites you about Freedom Cities?
Freedom cities are an incredibly exciting concept to me because it's one way that we can actually start to iterate again and innovate. I think that iteration and innovation and these quick cycles between building different pieces of technology really determines how quick your technology evolves. It also determines the safety of it and eventually determines cost. If we want cheap energy again in the United States, we have to be able to step outside the existing regulatory frameworks and try things that haven't been tried before, or try things that have been done, 50 years ago, but we forgot. And we can't wait for federal regulators to go through the multi-year process of rulemaking on every single one of these technology categories. We need to focus on this. We need to beat China. China is currently building 12 nuclear reactors while we're building 0. They're investing $440 billion into a nuclear build out across the country. And we're, sitting here squabbling over, small hundreds of millions of dollar investments where the regulatory environment is not even properly formatted to be able to scale out. So I think the fastest way to step outside of that is to be able to have an opt-in system where you can simply say, we're building these nuclear reactors under a different framework and it is going to be safe. And we have the best people in the world working on it, but we don't have to wait for these incredibly long timelines of, Washington, D.C. figuring out how to build things.
Great. And let's say in 10 years, everything goes according to plan. What does a world of cheap energy look like? How does that transform manufacturing, kind of American industry?
Absolutely. I think it's such an incredibly exciting prospect of having cheap energy in the United States. Again, most people don't realize how important energy is. I think one of the reasons that we don't have, a strong industrial industry today is that we don't have a metals industry in the United States. Most of our metals come from overseas. And metals are really like the first step to reindustrialization. And the entire industry is based on energy cost, right? If you want to know why, China makes the world's aluminum, it's because they have cheap energy from coal. If we want to make aluminum again, we need to be able to electrolyze it cheaply, which means we need cheap electricity. If we want steel again, we need to be able to make, hydrogen very cheaply, and we need to be able to use very cheap steam methane reforming or other ways of getting carbon into the steel and be able to do that at very, very low energy costs. So I think the world looks very different. I think advanced manufacturing, robotics, and metals are happening in the United States again.
Great. Thanks for coming on the Freedom Cities podcast.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
This is Mark Lutter, and thanks for joining the Freedom Cities podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more conversations.